for Protecting Women Online Research Seminar Series. My name is Alba Morales, and I will be chairing today's session. This is the last session of the year, so I'm super happy to have Suzie Dunn as our guest speaker today. And before we start, I would like to give a brief introduction about our speaker. So Suzie Dunn is the interim director of, sorry, I have my notes here. So she is the interim director of the Law and Technology Institute and an assistant professor at Dalhousie University Schulich School of Law. Her research centers on the intersections of equality, technology, and the law. She's also a research partner on a 4-year SSHRC funded research project on young people's experiences with sexual violence online and digital safety. And today, Suzie's talk is about navigating safety in digital age, trends, data, and responses to technology-facilitated violence. So with this, I would like to welcome Suzie. It's a pleasure to have you here today. So please, Suzie, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much for inviting me. I'll just share my screen here. Yeah, so today we're going to have a conversation about tech-facilitated violence and some of the trends that we're seeing, some of data that I've been collecting over the last few years on 2 particular projects, and then some of the responses to tech-facilitated violence, both from a legal and a non-legal perspective. And so we'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then after that, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about tech-facilitated gender-based violence? So it's really largely an umbrella term that's used to describe the use of digital technologies to perpetrate interpersonal harassment, abuse, and violence. And typically, when we're looking at the gender-based element of it, we're looking at the ways that it impacts trans or cisgendered women and girls, gender non-conforming people, agender or non-binary people. And so this might show up in different ways. This might show up in the data of who is targeted more commonly. So gender-based violence are areas where we see a lot more women targeted, or it could be in the impact. So even though we might see self-reporting data of people of all genders experiencing a particular type of harm, when we actually look at the consequences of those types of harms, we'll see a gendered element of it. And there's a wide variety of harms that can be included in this. It can range from doxing to trolling to voyeurism, intimate image sharing, sexual extortion, stalking. And so there's a significant amount of terms that can be included in this. 2 reports that are helpful to read if you want a little bit more on the definition. One I wrote a few years ago with Suzie, that just has an overview of tech-facilitated violence. And another is quite a comprehensive report written by Cynthia Koo from the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund called Deplatforming Misogyny. And there's been all sorts of studies on tech-facilitated violence. I find a large portion of the studies are focused on what we call image-based sexual abuse. So this is intimate image sharing. This can include deepfakes. And we've seen some really comprehensive studies done, particularly out of the UK and Australia. This image-based sexual abuse study that you can see featured here is one of the more comprehensive ones that we've seen globally that looks specifically to this issue. And then we've seen some more specified research being done on things like sexualized deepfakes. Some of the things that are really unique about tech-facilitated violence, particularly from a legal perspective, is that there's challenges with addressing these types of harms, in part because you see cross-jurisdictional abuse. So we're seeing this particularly with sexual extortion cases that might be run by criminal enterprises, where they might be run out of a foreign country, but the abuse is occurring within your jurisdiction. So it can create a lot of issues around finding legal remedies. Due to the anonymity of the internet, it's easy for the abuser to hide their identity. So again, when you're seeking legal recourse or trying to determine who it is that's causing harms against a person, anonymity can cause issues. within circumstances like intimate partner violence, there's a real constant access to the victim and survivor through connected devices. So all of us are generally carrying our phones with us at all times. And so unlike other forms of abuse, the perpetrator has constant access to us due to our need to be connected to our digital devices pretty much on a 24-hour basis. We also see issues with the perpetual nature of digital content. So this comes up specifically in intimate images where although the harm initially occurs on the first distribution of that image, even if you're able to get that first image taken down, if it's duplicated, that image can resurface over and over and over. And so every time it resurfaces, it's a new moment of victimization. And then every time it's viewed by a new person, it's a new moment of victimization. And this can last to lifelong victimization, as these images can pop up over and over and over through a person's lifetime. And this is largely in part because of the ease of duplication and replication of content online. When it comes to other forms of harassment, we see a wide breadth of audiences witnessing the abuse. And so when we think of things like defamatory content, privacy invasive content, publishing personal information, doxing, you can post this on social media or on large group chats and spread this information quite widely. And then also we see the opportunities for abusers to join forces on digital platforms to organize attacks. So this is when we're thinking about network harassment or other forms of callouts to say, here's a person that we believe is deserving of a particular form of attack. Often here's their contact information or their name. And so you can see these large scale, sometimes semi-coordinated attacks on a particular person. So one area of research that I've been working on over the last few years is a project with the Center for International Governance Innovation called Supporting Safer Digital Spaces. So this is a project that's working in two phases. I worked on the first phase of the project, which looked at 13 different types of online harms, ranging from death threats and rape threats, to being doxxed, to networked harassment, to online impersonation, being called discriminatory names, having nude images shared, or being tracked by GPS. And we surveyed over 18,000 people of all genders across 18 different countries to ask them about their self-reported experiences with these types of harms, the impacts of them, and then what types of supports they sought out when they'd experienced these types of harms. And the second phase of the project is looking at another 18 countries. And the second phase of the project will be doing more specific regional reporting to look at the way that these trends show up in different regions like MENA regions, in Asia, in Latin America. Because what we found is that both in what the harms look like, the consequences of the harms, and the types of help and legislation that people want to see, there's significant regional differences. And so it's important whenever we're thinking about tech-facilitated gender-based violence to recognize, that if you are a woman in the Middle East, your experiences of tech-facilitated violence are going to be very different compared to those who are living in a country like Canada. So this report has global findings for it, but we also divided and created little slide decks for each of the countries that we looked at. So I just thought I'd use Canada as an example. Most of the countries that we looked at were from the majority world. The priority in the study was to collect data from countries where there was a lack of data in order to bring attention to those countries. But we also included some other countries such as Canada and Germany to get a sense of what was happening in those jurisdictions as well.
From these findings is that when you look at the question of online gender-based violence, asking people who they recognize it's a problem for in their country, most people recognize that women were at high risk of experiencing these types of harms. But the interesting data that came out of this study, and this was across board for all of the countries where it was safe for us to ask questions about sexual orientation and transgendered status, we found extremely high reporting rates amongst the LGBTQ community and recognition that they are a specifically vulnerable community who's being targeted by these types of harms. And something that was interesting in this data is that although in some cases there was similar self-reporting rates of things like intimate image sharing between from men or women or non-binary people, what we found was that the impact was often more significant for women and gender minorities and sexual orientation minorities. And what we found around, what were people's self-reported experiences of experiencing harm, again, we saw these significantly high rates amongst members of the LGBTQ community and relatively high rates among women for particular types of harms. We saw increased rates, particularly around things like sexual harms when it came to the gender differences between who was experiencing what type of harms. But then we saw numbers that were much more similar in things like privacy and security-based harms between men and women. One thing that was interesting and consistent across most countries that we surveyed was if you look at the gender of the party inflicting the harm, we did see significant gender differences here. Most people reported that if they were able to identify the gender of the person who was causing them harm, that they were able to identify that it was a man who was the person who was perpetrating the harm. Due to anonymity, a large portion of people did not know the gender of the person who was causing them harm. And then 16% in Canada reported that they knew that it was a woman who was the person causing them harm in these digital spaces. And you can see pretty significant impacts of the harm on a person's personal life. Most highly rated was often impacts to mental health. Almost half of women reported that they faced significant harms to their mental health. And the data that we collected here was we had a rating system from 1 to 5. And the numbers that we pulled here were people who were, I believe, in 4 and 5, maybe 3, 4, and 5. So these are people who are reporting high rates of harm in these categories. So women, half were experiencing mental health harms. We saw significant personal reputational harms, risks to physical safety. A quarter of women reported that they felt risks to their physical safety after experiencing forms of tech-facilitated violence. And tragically, looking at the numbers of it impacting a person's desire to live, particularly in the LGBTQ population, which we know already have statistically high rates of suicide and suicidality in those populations, you see 28% of people having their desire to live being impacted by tech-facilitated violence, which is a really tragic circumstance. And importantly, a statistic that we saw as well was that it impacted people's ability to express themselves online. And though I'm not going to show any of the statistics on these slides, what we found was that a solution for a lot of people was actually to remove themselves off of the internet or to stop speaking about particular topics, which is something that we really don't want to see in digital spaces. We want people to be able to be online, feel free to express themselves, to express their political viewpoints without feeling at risk and feeling that the only choice they have to feel safe online is to actually remove themselves from the internet. An area that we're really interested in, I think a lot of studies are starting to show, trends in what the types of harms are. We have a better sense of what the types of harms are today, looking at the existing studies. But one of the questions that we're really interested in as researchers is what are effective resources? And my apologies for my scratchy voice. I've got a bit of a cold over the holiday season. But when we're thinking about effective resources, the thing that we're seeing is that a lot of people are either not reporting to anyone, or if they are reporting to people, they're often reporting to informal sources. So they're looking to their spouse or their partner, their friends or their family. And those are people that they're actually finding are quite helpful in providing them support. But less people are accessing more formalized reports. So this includes civil society organizations, going to a lawyer, reporting to the police. Very few people reported that they were connecting with the online platform to let them know that abuse was happening on their platform. And very few were connecting to helplines. And part of that, we believe, is in part because there's not a lot of resources that are available. Depending on the country that you're in, there might not be a helpline, there might not be a civil society organization that you can directly connect. I know in the UK, you got the Revenge Porn Hotline, which is an extraordinary resource, but in Canada, there's no such existing hotline. So I imagine you'd probably see a different statistical outcome if you were doing this research in the United Kingdom. And then outside this research, so there's a few organizations in Canada that do research on various forms of tech-facilitated violence and intimate image sharing. And one of the things that we found interesting, that we found both in our study and in the study here from the CyberTip, which is an organization that looks at child sexual exploitation, is we are starting to see an increase in male victimization in particular forms of tech-facilitated violence. And so while I think it's important to recognize the really critical lens of gender-based violence, that's important to think about these issues through, we are starting to see trends where men and boys are being targeted by specific types of harms. So one area where we've seen a significant increase in this is in financial sexual extortion amongst especially young men and boys. And this occurs when someone, usually pretending to be a young woman, goes on the internet, connects with a young man or boy, and starts to engage in a sexual conversation. They're swapping images, and once the boy has shared a sexualized image of himself, those images are then used to financially extort this young person. And in Canada, we've seen this lead to several suicide amongst young men and boys, which I think really goes to show that we need to have more supports as well for young men and boys, both in educational systems to let them know what to do in these types of circumstances, and to provide specific gender-based supports for them in those circumstances. The Canadian Centre for Child Protection found that a lot of people who've been victimized in this way aren't finding formalized supports and are often going to places like Reddit to figure out what to do. And some of the advice on Reddit is actually quite good in helping them deal with these situations. But again, it shows that there's a bit of a lack of formalized support systems in place for victims of these types of harms. The next project that I've been working on is called DIY Digitally Informed Youth. And so this is, again, a Canadian-based project where I've been working with a group of 3 other researchers, Chris Dietzel, Katie Mendez, and Alexa Dodge, interviewing young people about their experiences with sexual content online. And the thing that's really interesting, I think, right now is when we look at legislatively, what governments are very interested in creating laws and protections around, it's often around protecting children and regulating sexual content. So these are really rich areas for research to ask people about what their experiences are, and then also what remedies and supports they need in these areas. Because when we're thinking about creating policy, support systems, regulation, or legislation, we really advocate for having evidence-based research. But often what we find is that there's a real lack of research, specifically regionally based research, to back up claims that say that young people are safe or unsafe on the internet in these particular ways, and that what sexual content is actually causing harms versus which sexual content can actually be educational or helpful in some circumstances. So what we did for this project is we went across Canada and we tried to select a variety of regions. We looked at urban and rural youth in the Northern Territory of the Yukon, in Alberta, in Ontario, in Quebec, which is our French-speaking province, and in Nova Scotia. And we reached out to 25 different youth-based organizations that focused on specific groups. So we were really interested in making sure that we spoke to groups of young people that we know were specifically targeted. So we looked at organizations that work with lesbian, gay, and trans youth, immigrants, and new resident youth. We also looked at specific sports organizations, rural farming organizations, girls groups, really just trying to get quite an expansive collection of experiences from people. And our focus groups weren't regionally representative. We later did a study that was regionally representative of young people. But in our focus groups, you can see that we actually overcompensated for groups of people that we know are specifically targeted. So we had, high rates of rural youth. We had high rates of sexually diverse youth, gender diverse youth, and youth from a wide variety of areas across Canada. And what we found in our preliminary findings is that young people who were experiencing sexual harms online, the way that they were targeted was really shaped by their identity and their personal interests. So these are things if someone was racialized, they described racialized harms that they were experiencing in tandem with the sexualized harms that they were experiencing. If they were trans, they overlapped with their trans identity. And so the way that harms manifested were really unique. So when we're thinking about solutions, we can't just talk about solutions to young people in general. We need to be thinking specifically about intersectional identity factors and the ways that those can impact both the harms that a person is experiencing, but also the types of remedies and supports that they might want. We found that a lot of algorithms were fueling the harm. So a lot of people were being fed contents that they didn't necessarily want access to. Young men and boys, although we were asking them about sexual content, often referred to being fed really violent, what we call gore contents on the internet that they really did not want to receive. And then ultimately, when we were asking young people about what they wanted for supports, they really wanted anonymous, non-judgmental, and confidential supports. We found that often when young people reported to adults, in some cases, their harms were minimized, but often the thing that happened was that the harm was really escalated. There was a lot of victim blaming. So saying, why did you share those images? Why did you contact that person? Why were you even in that chat group? And then often the reaction is to escalate this very quickly, involving higher ups in the school, reporting to police, and then taking their technology away. So having their phones taken away. Which were found to be very ineffective solutions and taught young people that they couldn't trust the adults that they were going to for help. And often the lesson learned was that they shouldn't go to adults. Whereas in the experiences that young people had when they were able to describe the harms they were experiencing to an adult in a non-judgmental manner that allowed them to maintain some sense of control over the situation, explain the behaviors that they found harmful or not harmful, and were more meaningfully engaged in finding solutions to their problems, that this was much more effective and created a much more trust-based system for young people. We also found that much of the education that young people are experiencing is a fear-based approach, that the internet is inherently dangerous, that if anything like their intimate images are shared without consent, it can be life-ruining, that they'll never be able to find jobs. And again, this type of educational focus on fear-based and abstinence-based messaging around technology, that they shouldn't be using it, they should be avoiding certain areas, was again ineffective, and that more effective educational messaging were things that were focused on youth rights, and coming from a perspective of understanding that young people will be engaging online and using more of a harm reduction approach seem to be more effective when talking to young people. We also found that a lot of young people are misinformed around their rights. Again, from a UK context, I don't know what the regulation is around things like child sexual abuse material. But in Canada, we have criminal legislation around child sexual abuse material that defines any images of a person under the age of 18 that are nude or sexualized are technically child sexual abuse material. But in Canada, we have a carve-out in our law where the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized that it's actually not, there should be exceptions to those rules for young people who take nude images of themselves or for sexualized images of legal, like in age sexual activities with their sexual partners, as long as those images are kept to themselves and kept private. But here in Canada, what we find is that children are often misinformed about that law, and they're told that any images they take of themselves are inherently child pornography. And so then when those images are shared without consent and they're experiencing sexual abuse in relation to images that they took legally, they're afraid to report because they're concerned that they, as the person victimized who is featured in the image, is going to be criminalized for creating child pornography contents. And so I think when it comes to communicating with young people about intimate image sharing, it's important to recognize that intimate image sharing is a normal and regular part of youth sexual developments. And again, depending on your jurisdiction, you'd have to double check this for the UK. But in Canada, a young person who's taken sexualized images of themselves that have been later used in abusive ways will never get legally in trouble for initially taking those images. And that's really important messaging, because also in our research, we found that young people who do think that that content is illegal are much less likely to seek supports. And then also, if you're interested, our website, DIYdigitalsafety.ca, has resources. Again, some of these are Canadian focused, so might not be as relevant to the populations you're working with, but can be helpful to think of ideas about ways to share information with young people about what their rights are to their sexual content online, to make sure that that messaging is very clear. We've also written some public reports on various issues addressing sexual violence online amongst teens. One area that we're very interested in is advocating for curricula policy changes. So this is around sexual education in schools. In Canada, each province designs its own curriculum for talking about digital harms or sexualized harms. And we find that from province to province, the way that young people are educated about these types of issues, including gender-based violence and digital safety in dating relationships online, is often lacking. And so one of the reforms that we think is really important is to include mandatory curriculum where young people would be taught about tech-facilitated gender-based violence, image-based abuse sharing, so that they can gain information early on in their education to start thinking about these issues. Because again, I think we're in this generation of people who are really digitally involved in their lives, but education, parenting, and other adult supports haven't really caught up in specializing in understanding what these issues are or how to help. And so embedding that into curricula, I think would be one solution that could really help young people when they're trying to figure out what to do in these situations. So when it comes to responses to sexual content regulation, we're starting to see movements globally around creating criminal or civil laws to address tech-facilitated gender-based violence. There's a UN cybercrime document that addresses many of these issues. When it comes to sexual content regulation, we've seen various criminal and civil laws be introduced. In Canada, we've seen things like obscenity, child sexual abuse material, which is sometimes called child pornography. But that language is really shifting, trying to not use the term child pornography. There's voyeurism, which is secretive taking of sexual images, and then the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. And so there's interesting questions when we're thinking about regulating this type of content. Do you regulate the creation, possession, accessing, or distribution, or just the distribution? Do you include real or fictionalized images? And then also, do you include private use exceptions for things like teenagers' use of intimate images? In civil law, we've seen the use of privacy torts. In the UK, I believe you mostly rely on the tort of breach of confidence to address intimate image sharing. We've also seen the introduction of several statutorily protected bodies, which I'll speak to next. Fast track options, which are options that are simplified procedures in court so that someone can get a quicker injunction or court order to get specific content taken down. We've seen movements in family law jurisdictions to expand the definition of family violence to include tech-facilitated harm so that people can get orders, court orders, to protect them from various forms of family violence. In Canada, we're also starting to see a movement towards creating bail orders and probation orders that specifically speak to tech-facilitated violence. So in the context of intimate partner violence, one of the things that we see is that people often have shared accounts or different ways of digitally surveilling a person. So when we're thinking about getting protection orders around no contact, being really explicit that includes, no GPS monitoring, no monitoring through Internet of Things devices such as home security devices, tracking iPhone locations, this type of thing. And then for intimate images, we've also seen the use of civil law. So the use of copyrights. If a person's taken images of themselves, they're able to protect themselves through copyright. An area that I think is becoming more and more important is around moderating platforms. So we're starting to see movements of this, particularly in Australia, the UK, and Europe, around creating legislation that actually requires specific moderation policies on platforms. And these types of responses are incredibly important because although legal responses play an important role, both in their expressive role in showing people, what the state believes is proper or improper behavior, but because most legal procedures are quite lengthy, and it can take a lot of time before you can get an order to have content being taken down, often one of the most helpful ways for a person to get help is through the platforms. And if platforms have good regulation and good policies around removing gender-based violence content and protecting users from various abusers, this can be a really effective form of protection. And so we're starting to see movements where there are regulations by governments requiring platforms to behave in a particular way. And this is incredibly important for things like revenge platform-based sites. So not the large social media sites, not the large pornography sites, but there's often purpose-built sites. So when we think about deepfake platforms, sometimes these platforms can be called revenge pornography platforms as well, where the point of the platform is to release problematic content. We see this with not just sexualized images, but reputational platforms where people are called out as cheaters and this type of thing. How do you address these types of platform-based harms where it's not a specific individual targeting a certain individual, but it's broader people coming together and sharing and collecting masses of information around gender-based violence. When it comes to these protective bodies and positive legislation, the e-safety commissioner in Australia is often held up as the gold standard of a country that's really taken action on providing government-based supports for people who've been impacted by tech-facilitated violence. So it has a reporting system for image-based abuse. You can also report other types of online bullying for children and other forms of abuse to the e-safety commissioner. The e-safety commissioner also has a really helpful website that provides safety planning techniques, information on content removal, and also reports where they're doing research on these types of harms and the various responses to them. Here in Canada, we've got several of these statutorily protected bodies. There's one in Nova Scotia called CyberScan, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, which also helps with adult intimate image removal. And in BC, there's an Intimate Image Protection Service. So these are organizations that are government protected, government funded, where people can call and get supports. In Nova Scotia, it broadly captures intimate images and various forms of cyberbullying, including impersonation or harassment, where some of the other centers are more limited to intimate image sharing. Again, these fast track options are a really important opportunity for people here in British Columbia, which is one of our provinces in Canada. We have a civil resolution tribunal where someone can fill out an online form. It's a very easy way to get a quick court order to get content taken down. And in Quebec, our French-speaking province, they also have a fast track option for people who would like to get intimate images taken down. In the UK, of course, you've got the Revenge Porn Hotline. If you are interested in this, a book was recently published that understands the evolution of this organization and talks about some of their successes and challenges that they've experienced. But I think it's a really helpful book on understanding the ways that you can provide really good, victim-based support. That's not always legislative. There's laws that can be very helpful. But often the supports that people are looking for are technical or social supports on how to manage the harms that they're experiencing and how to get content taken down. And the final point that I'll speak to is an organization called Stop NCII. So this is an organization where people can create hashes of their intimate images in order to create this string of numbers that can then be sent to this organization that is then shared with a lot of the major social media websites, some pornography websites, so that if a person has intimate images of themselves and they're concerned about that content being shared, this will preemptively protect them from having that content appear on their websites. And so, again, these are just really useful examples of resolutions that people have come up with over the years to address tech-facilitated violence. And right now, I think that there is an incredible emphasis on intimate image sharing, which we can understand why there's this focus on intimate image sharing. It's so personal. It creates such specific harms. But I think when we're thinking about helps and supports, we also need to start expanding this outside of just sexualized harms on the internet to larger gender-based violence experiences, including harassment and other types of harms. So I'll leave it there, and then we can open it up to questions and answers. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Suzie, for this amazing presentation. So if you have any question for the public, you can post it on the Q&A. I see that there is a question there already, and this is from Arosha. So yeah, so before jumping into the questions, just please everybody just give a big clap to our amazing speaker. It was a really good talk. So yes, Arosha is asking about, other than content recommendation algorithms promoting radicalizing harmful content, were there other features of the platforms that were identified as problematic? Were there any features identified as supporting harm minimization or protection or promoting pro-social interactions?
Yeah, so one of the areas that we saw as a risk of harm was the ease of access for being able to connect with young people. So a lot of, especially when we look at more organized predatory campaigns against children, the ease of just being able to connect with someone through Snapchat or through these various organizations is something that's been a bit challenging. So for example, we've seen with Roblox, which is an online game for children, they're changing their policy now so that you're only allowed to communicate with people who are like in age. So that's been one interesting solution. It's still rolling out. We'll see how effective it'll actually be. But when it comes to adults having access to children, one of the trends that we saw was that, an adult predator might send out a lot of information to a group of young people. And then once one person followed them, they would then try and follow everyone in the school. So it's easy to create these kind of legitimate looking accounts that make it easier to contact people. And a lot of the folks that we spoke with were really interested in different technical options, so different blocking options. People were very interested in the ways that social media companies might be able to identify users who create new accounts. Because one of the challenges is that once you've blocked someone, if they can just very easily create another account, you'll often see that pattern, especially amongst adult abusers, where they'll just go out and create new accounts on either the same social media platform or on other ones to continue the type of abuse. And then a lot of the features that were really helpful for harm minimization. So most of the oral interviews that I did were with young people. And so one of the things that they were looking for were spaces that were actually smaller, where they can have more directed group conversations with each other. So in Discord, having spaces, so for example, like LGBTQ spaces, where people have kind of been verified or vetted through their social community, where they can create safe spaces to share information and safety strategies with each other, was something that a lot of them advocated for.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting on that. There is a question from Cassidy Weeks. Are there plans to run further data collection in the UK? And I guess also in other countries, right? South America, I don't know.
Yeah, so the phase 2 of the CG project was really focusing more on majority world countries. So I think the only non-majority world country that was done in the second phase of the study was South Korea, just because South Korea is such an interesting country when it comes to the advancement of technology that they've got, and there's been really significant issues with tech-facilitated violence. So there wasn't plans for data collection in the UK. As far as I know. But again, there have been some really good studies out of the UK, largely again focusing on intimate image abuse. I'm not as aware if there's larger data studies being done on tech-facilitated violence. But one of the things that I think is important to advocate for is when you think of organizations like Ofcom and whoever else is working with the online safety folks in the UK, is really pushing for including resources around data collection and research and resources, because ultimately it's helpful to have legislation and helplines, but we often need research and data to show whether helplines and laws are actually effective. So I think there needs to be ongoing research, but there's no plans with the CG project to look at the UK.
Okay, thank you, Susie. We also have another question from Freywood. What are the mechanisms to protect children or to maintain them safe online?
Yeah, and this is such a hard question.
Yes.
You know, it's such a hard question. I think honestly, the thing that we've found in our research when we're talking to young people, the most effective tool that young people have reported is having trusted adults to have conversations with. So when things that are happening to them that are weird online or disturbing online or upsetting online or sexually exploitative, that they have someone to go to and to talk to who they can negotiate those issues with. Ultimately, we found that that has been the best solution to helping kids with problems online. There's all sorts of proposals on how to protect children. There's surveillance devices you can put on children's phones. There's parental devices you can put on children's phones. I think parental modifications on devices can be really helpful for young children in particular, to ensure that they don't have access to inappropriate content. But once teenagers become teenagers, like, they're gonna find a way around those technical supports. So again, I think that messaging and making sure that kids are being able to talk to their parents and their teachers about these problems, who can then help them address it in real time, is critically important. And then we've also seen a real movement towards age verification and age gating on social media sites. I think there's some challenges with that. Like, I think when you go to age gating, there's larger privacy issues that come with how do we address age
Verify,
verification
right?
amongst
Yes,
all people, which can be really, really privacy invasive. And then also
exactly.
one of the challenges about age gating is that when social media companies don't allow young people on their platforms, they also then can say, well, young people aren't on our platform, so we don't actually need to deal with youth safety anymore. Where I think like the better model is to ensure that platforms are safe so that young people can engage on them. But there's a real mix of positions on what can lead to child safety.
And 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 I think it's also connected to what you were saying before about effective resources, though, right? So you said that 50% of the people that were victims of online abuse, they contact someone that was closer to them, like for example, a
Yeah.
spouse and a partner. But I also was curious to know if you did some research on the type of help they provided, but also if they also need to have some kind of education about what kind of help they should provide to victims, right? For example, doctors or friends or family that may not be as literate about
Yeah.
harms online and what to do, right? So I was curious
Yeah.
to know if you have any other research about that.
No, and so we don't have research on like what are the types of helps that people are getting when they're going to more informal supports. But that is something that we actually shifted our direction when we started doing our research. Initially, we were really pushing for specifically like educational policies in schools. But then, especially when you're talking to young people, like a lot of them don't go to their schools. They go to other resources. They go a lot to like victim service organizations, youth organizations. I think of a lot of adults will go to, wherever their communities are. And so one of the things that we've been suggesting is that we need broader public education campaigns that are specific for the people who are kind of the first responders to this type of help. So people who are already working in community, either doing anti-violence work, gender-based work, youth work, to make sure that they have the skill sets that they need. We did a secondary project just in Nova Scotia, the province that I'm in, about women's organizations. And they found that women's organizations want to help and do have a lot of people reporting victimization on tech facilitated violence, but that they often felt like they lacked the skill set to properly address them. So I think there's a real need for tools and education that are specified to those types of organizations where people are going to help, and towards parents, and generally towards friends and family, so that when someone does use more informal supports, people actually have the best practice tools available to them to provide that type of support.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Thank you. I have another question. This question is from Lorraine. Well, she says, first of all, thanks so much, Suzie, considering that the ways that victim survivors responded to tech facilitated abuse, were there any particularly surprising findings, or what did you find most informative and interesting? Thank you.
I think I was actually really surprised about the high rates of male victimization. I was really,
Yeah.
really, really surprised by that. Like in our tech facilitated violence study by CG, like if you look at the numbers, there's really
Yeah.
high rates of male victimization. I think I wasn't surprised by the fact that like most perpetration was done by men. So I think that like we're in the same way that we think about physical violence, like men actually experience high rates of physical violence, but it's often like male on male physical violence. But I was really surprised I think in the CG study, it might have been that one or it might have been one of the other ones. There's actually higher rates of self-reporting of men experiencing intimate image sharing. So that was really, really surprising for us. And then I think the content that we were most surprised with the youth that we were talking to, again, was the young men who were reporting really graphic, violent gore contents, like in a way that I never see that content on my feeds. Like I never, ever, ever, where these boys were describing seeing like graphic, violent murders, industrial accidents, like really, really, really problematic content. And when we think about, again, the larger problems around, creating a safer world, especially when we recognize that men and boys are often perpetrators of gender-based violence and tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And as young boys and young men, the content that's coming through their feed every day is really, really normalizing, at least viewing really violent content every day, and like what are the impacts for young men and boys there. So I think that's interesting. I think it was also probably just really surprising and interesting for me because most of my research has been focused on women and other gender minorities. So it was just interesting to also see the data on men and boys.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have another question. Well, people are very active in the Q&A.
Great.
If this is one is from Lian. Hi there. I'm interested in the challenges of investigating these instances. Does any of your research focus on the challenges faced by law enforcement supporting victims through the investigative process? So, for example, being able to capture evidence of the abuse, to support prosecutions, technical barriers, etc.
Yeah, so that's a really, really important piece, especially because often when people are experiencing online harms, one of their first reactions is to get the content taken down or deleted, um, which is such a natural expectation. But people actually need to document things before they're deleted in order to collect digital evidence. And because there's expectations, again, I'm not sure what the laws are in the UK, but there's very specific regulation around the way that digital evidence is submitted and understood in courts. So here in Canada, we've created a website called techsafety.ca that explains various forms of tech-facilitated gender-based violence and actually gives instructions for people how to collect digital evidence. So how to have like if they're experiencing harassment, how to have a log book that documents all of these things. Certain things like it's really important to keep the original email rather than just a screenshot of it, because that's the way that you can get access to the metadata, which is often really important in identifying who a person is that's causing you harms. And I wrote a paper 2 years ago with Moira Aikenhead around some of the challenges of anonymity. And so how do the courts manage that? Also with police reporting. So if someone comes and reports to the police, but they don't actually know who's causing them the harm because the person's anonymous, what are the ways that the police are addressing that? Are they doing proper investigations to de-identify that person? Are they able to move forward, with providing supports to the victim? And then if a person is able to get to a criminal trial, how is it that they're able to prove that this anonymized account is the person that they say it is? So we've written some papers on that, but I think that the evidentiary piece for digital evidence cases is really important. There are a lot of technical barriers to that, and again, need for legal training and resources so that lawyers and judges and police officers can understand how to collect and advance that type of evidence.
Okay, thank you, Suzie. I think the last question that I have here is if you're planning to do some extra research on gender-based violence or tech-facilitated gender-based violence in Africa. I think you did some kind of collection, right? You presented at the beginning.
Yeah, so the CG report, which right now for phase 1, we did look at a few countries in Africa, mostly Northern Africa. But the second study has a lot of data on countries from Africa. Like that was a major focus. I'd also, if you're interested in research on tech-facilitated violence in the African region, there's 2 organizations I recommend looking at. One is called Policy. It's POLLICY. I believe they're based out of Uganda or Nigeria. They do really specific research on the African experience. And then the Association for Progressive Communication. A lot of their work is more focused on the majority world. A lot of it's from Latin America, but they do research on Africa and North Africa and the Middle East. So if you're interested on that regionally specific research, those are 2 organizations I would recommend looking to.
Okay. Thank you very much, Suzie. I think we have now closed with the comments and we're on time, actually. So, yeah. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining today's session. As I said, this is the last session of the year or of our seminar series, and we were very happy to have you, Suzie. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon in the future and collaborate on some work with the center.
All right. Thanks so much for inviting me. Bye, everybody.
So, thank you.